24 February 1987, Bonn, West Germany. I washed the dishes of a man who once signed deportation orders. He complains the water is too cold. He has never apologized. A sentence written in a lined notebook with a cheap blue pen. It is not shouted. It is not published. It is dangerous anyway. It names the thawed places where memory still ices over. It names a home guard front, a sink, a ledger. He writes it as a worker in an Altenheim 2 tram stops north of the Rhine. He writes it as an old boy who carried bricks in 1945. He writes it as Karl, son of Lotta, late of Kassel, survivor of the arithmetic of rooms and the mathematics of guilt. May 8, 1945, Kassel. The war ends. The city does not. Kassel is rubble and smoke, and missing persons reports pinned to wooden boards on Friedrichsplatz. The Allied occupation reports call it severely damaged, industrial capacity depressed, morale low. Henschel and Son, where tanks were built, is a carcass. The main station is a laceration on a map. Karl is 13. His father is missing in the east. The Red Cross cards say Letzte Nachricht, 1944, bei Tarnopol. No one expects him to return. The arithmetic of absence is simple and bottomless. One father minus one family equals 3 mouths on one ration book. He lifts broken bricks from the crater by the church. He stacks them with other boys, older women, the Trümmerfrauen who will become a cliché but are, at the time, simply hands, backs, breath. Photographs from the time show scarves tied tight against dust, a domestic army moving stone by stone. Bundesarchiv records count loads hauled per day. The numbers do not describe the cough. They do not describe the way a kettle sounds when you fill it with water that is not quite clean. May 17, 1945, the first Allied patrol enters the street. British helmets, English on lips that are designed for other consonants. The curfew is 9 p.m. The town hears a new clock. A notice is nailed to the charred beam of a bakery. Surrender all weapons, register party membership, report at the commandantur for instructions. A posted paper is stronger than any wall still standing. Karl watches a truck unload guardrails. Sappers check for booby traps, the remnants of a police station stripped of eagles and swastikas. The hammer and chisel lash out at stone. A crest becomes a void. Night is quiet and enormous. Fear is a ceiling you cannot see. The fear is not theatrical, it is specific. The Allied intelligence summaries speak of resentment against the Nazi Party leadership, limited articulation of guilt, concern over reprisals. The list of men who have reason to be afraid is long. The list of men who have reason to be afraid is long. The list of men who admit it out loud is short. June 1945, the market opens and closes like a wound. Official ration cards give margarine, sugar, bread. Kids learn the mathematics of calories the hard way. 200 grams of bread is breakfast and dinner if there is no lunch. If you are 14 and tall, that bread never seems to end up in your stomach. Karl writes, later, the stomach became a clock. He learns the other arithmetic fast. A pack of cigarettes equals potatoes times 2. A can of army corned beef equals boots with the soles intact. The black market on a side street near the Bodeplatz is a classroom. Men in coats barter the last good suits for a month of food. The cigarettes are American. The slogans roll off the tongue, Lucky Strike, Camel. The uses are varied, smoke or spend. Adults break the rules they shouted about last year. Kids notice. The hunger winter of 1946-47 hardens the lesson. The Ruhr's coal freezes under snow. Rail lines clog. Potatoes rot in fields that cannot be reached. The official caloric ration in the British zone, according to occupation reports, sinks to 1,000 calories per day. To prevent mass unrest, shipments prioritized, reads an internal memo. How do you prioritize hunger? You don't. It prioritizes you. In January 1947, Carl and his mother boil nettles. They make soup from a bone borrowed and returned until it is white and useless. In his mother's notebook, we held the spoon like a miracle. The children's eyes grew old before their faces. Neighbors whisper rumors, a farmer with bacon, a grocer with 3 loaves under the counter. A neighbor is found with American chocolate, and the rumor says she is sleeping with a soldier. Rumor is a currency as much as lucky strikes. There is a DP camp at the edge of town. Displaced persons, the Allied reports call them. The Zierenberg camp north of Kassel holds Poles, Ukrainians, stateless Jews. The fences are old wire. The guards are ex-Wehrmacht conscripts in British uniforms. The people inside wear civilian clothes, many too large. They avoid Germans. A United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration bulletin uses phrases that sound like mathematics. Population fluctuating, nutrition stable, but inadequate, desire for emigration high. One day in June 1945, a group of DPs passes through town. They are headed to a transfer point. They do not look at the houses. They do not look at the faces that look at them. They carry bundles and the photographic silence. Carl watches from a second-floor window with a hole in the pane. He remembers a man with a scar over his eye, a woman with hair cropped to her skull. He will write later, "They did not have to look to make us feel seen." The knowledge arrives in shards. A rumor that a camp lay near. A soldier's photograph of pits. A line in a report. Documentary evidence gathered in the district of Lublin clarifies the fate of the evacuated. The word clarifies does not belong in that sentence. The newspapers in 1945 say crimes and trials. The words slide around like marbles that refuse to stand still. July 1945, a questionnaire appears. It is long. 131 questions in the American zone, fewer in the British zone, but the spirit is the same. Name, date of birth, party membership dates, positions held, organizations joined, SA, SS, NSFK, NSKK, Hitlerjugend. Did you contribute to the Winterhilfswerk? Did you donate to party funds? Did you attend courses? The Fragebogen does not ask if you were afraid when the block warden snarled. It does not ask if you hated and left it at that. It asks for categories. The Sprechkammer is the court in these matters. Denazification. It is a word that sits heavy and awkward in the mouth. The categories seem precise: Hauptschuldige, major offenders; Belastet offenders; Minder belastet, lesser offenders; Mitläufer followers; Entlastet, exonerated. The mathematics of guilt promises to render moral life into a grid. The mathematics of grid, the reality is more like water finding cracks. Carl is too young to fill a questionnaire. His mother is not. She writes, "I joined the party in 1938 for the job. I attended no meetings. I never reported anyone." The block warden, who once came around with a list, now writes an affidavit on her behalf. Perseilschein, people call it, the Perseil certificate, a washing powder's clean name for a paper that says, "You're all right." Names are rewritten. I only joined to keep my position. I did not know. I only followed orders. The line is consistent. It is not always a lie. It is not always true. The Sprechkammer reads, consults, stamps. The arithmetic of paperwork begins to stand in for the arithmetic of remorse. In an Allied intelligence summary, a statistic is offered. By 1948, in the American zone, 3.6 million persons screened, 90,000 tried, 28,000 convicted, less than 1,000 categorized as major offenders. A British report privately notes that the process is arduous, leads to administrative paralysis, and must be streamlined for the sake of stability. Stability, a word like iron over a wound. A man in their street who once wore a brown shirt is declared Mitläufer. He returns to his desk at the Stadtverwaltung. A neighbor whose son wore black in the East is declared lesser offender. He pays a fine. He writes a letter to the paper about the rigidity of Allied demands. A teacher who led the girls in songs in 1939 is suspended, then reinstated because there are not enough teachers. The children need to read. The past must make room for chalk. Between 1945 and 1950, waves break inland. Expellees arrive. Germans expelled from East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, the Sudetenland, hunched on trains that do not keep time. 12 million people move, history's largest forced migration in Europe in the 20th century. 8 million come into the zones that will become West Germany. The arithmetic of rooms becomes a nightmare equation: 3 rooms, 2 families, 1 stove. In Kassel, the expellees arrive with bundles, mothers with children whose accents mark them as strangers. A town official assigns them to houses that are missing their roofs. The first fight is about firewood. The second is about beds. The third is about space itself. They take our jobs. They have suffered as we have. Both sentences are true. Tension nests in the halls. A man from Silesia is called Polak. He shows his German papers. The insult sticks anyway. The British military government issues directives. Locals must share. Prices must be controlled. Assaults against expellees will be punished. Occupation reports document friction in the passive voice. Incidents reported. Statistics do not hold tears. Oral histories recorded in the 1980s with expellees and locals talk about a slap in the stairwell, a shared loaf, a birth. A new arithmetic of belonging begins to write itself over the old one of blood and soil. It is not noble. It is necessary. The DP camp shrinks. People leave for America, for Palestine, for Argentina, for Canada. They leave in silence or with songs that are not sung by the town. A rabbi says a prayer over a parcel of land where there are no graves to be visited because the graves are too far away. A German woman with 3 children watching from the road feels a sob in a place she cannot name. She turns away because the baby needs milk. The mathematics of milk trumps the mathematics of mourning. June 20th, 1948, the currency reform changes the smell of the air. Old Reichsmarks become paper nobody wants. Deutsche Mark banknotes appear. Everyone receives 40 marks. The black market dies in a day. Karl remembers the shops the next morning. Bread, butter, shoes, real goods on real shelves. The newspapers call it miracle. It is not a miracle. It is policy. The Marshall Plan is shipments tracked in ledgers and train manifests. Wheat from America. Machines from Britain. Henschel in Kassel is retooled. Trucks instead of tanks. The British zone administrators report improvement in morale tied to material availability. Karl is 16. He goes to the factory with his uncle's lunch pail. He becomes an apprentice. He learns to turn bolts, to register measurements with calipers, to file a burr down to level. Precision becomes a way to forget. His file sings against iron. The file never lies. The men at the bench tell jokes that have been reconditioned. "We built tractors," one of them says, and everybody laughs with the part of their body that knows the joke is a shield. 1951 brings a law with a number, not a name. Article 31, colloquially the 31 Law. It allows the re-employment of civil servants dismissed by the Allies. Stability again, expertise again. The old administrators with new ties return to the Verwaltungsgericht, the ministries, the desks where the Incas learned how to dry over the years. They bring competence, they bring competence, they bring habits. The arithmetic of a state requires clerks who know how a file should feel. It is difficult to build a democracy from scratch, easier to sand the edges of a machine built for another purpose. Carl sees this in the faces at the city office where he registers for housing. The man behind the counter has a voice. Carl's mother knows. The man stamps a document. The stamp is the sound of a continuity no one admits. 1950s school books in Hesse and North Rhine-Westphalia are written quickly. They are careful. They mention the Nazis without details. They emphasize the suffering of bombings, the heroism of the Trümmerfrauen, the plight of expellees. They avoid the word Jew, except where necessary. They use passive constructions. People were taken. People disappeared. They teach caution. They teach compromise. They teach compromise. They teach children to make room in their mind for what cannot be spelled. Carl marries in 1956. His wife, Ilse, is from a refugee family, their accent softened by years. They have a son in 1957 and a daughter in 1961. They move into new housing built on the outskirts of Kassel. 3 rooms, a balcony, a cellar with a rack for glass jars. The furniture is not beautiful. It smells new and possible. The building has a name that numbers cannot occupy. Friedenstraße, Peace Street. The name is a plan, not a description. The factory hums. The Wirtschaftswunder writes itself into pay stubs and refrigerators. The Marshall Plan cranes are taken down. Carl is promoted. He becomes a foreman. He learns management words. He learns that stability is a religion. He prays by drilling quotas into a schedule. A Cold War is a new climate. It arranges the weather of politics. The Americans are friends now. The British are polite. The Soviets are the storm behind the hills. Carl watches soldiers in new German uniforms in 1955 and feels a stomach twist that is not quite a reflex and not quite loyalty. He reads about the Bundeswehr and hopes his son will be able to choose. The mathematics of guilt shifts in this climate. The Cold War needs West Germany. It needs competence and allegiance. Adenauer's government whispers, then says aloud, that integration and prosperity require forgetting with discipline. Amnesty laws pass. Trials are rare. A few are big. Frankfurt, 1963, Auschwitz trials. A newspaper in Kassel prints photographs of men in suits who once wore other clothing. The word Auschwitz becomes a sharp thing. People learn to hold it without cutting themselves, or to avoid it altogether. Carl watches television with Ilse in the evenings. He watches the prosecutors measure the distance between a signature and a body. He watches defendants say, "I did not recall." He hears, "I was never at the ramp." He hears, "I was in the office." The mathematics of guilt becomes the mathematics of rooms. Who was in which room at what time, and where were the keys, and did the door mean anything? It is easy to grow numb counting doors. 1968. Students in Frankfurt, Berlin, Bonn shout and march. Unter den Talaren, Muff von 1,000 Jahren, they say. Under the gowns, the mustiness of 1,000 years. Their father's generation is indicted in slogans and on posters. Karl's son, Jürgen, goes to a rally. He returns with pamphlets and bright eyes. He speaks about the emergency laws, about the continuity of elites, about the need to listen to those who cannot be heard. He accuses his father of silence. Carl listens. He feels the accusation as a bruise. He replies slowly. He says, "There are things we had to swallow to get here." He does not mention nights in 1946 when he fell asleep in a cold that a slogan cannot heat. 1970. A chancellor kneels in Warsaw. Carl watches on television. The image enters the house like a stranger. Willy Brandt kneels. Silence. The silence is uncomfortable and clean at the same time. Ilse says, "Good." Carl says nothing. Later he will write, "He did it for us, so we could see it done. Yet we did not do it. The factory changes owners. Henschel is sold, bought, merged. The lines of machines that once moved like a promise jitter and pause. The oil crisis in 1973 is a vocabulary of queues and lowered thermostats. Cuts arrive. Offices speak in the language of efficiency. A list of names. Karl is 51. He has given 35 years to production and precision. A man from Stuttgart with a tie and a smile says words like restructuring and unavoidable. A piece of paper says the rest. There is work in Bonn, someone says. Not factory work. Cleaning. Maintenance. The government town needs hands in its corners as much as in its councils. Karl and Ilse move in 1975. The kids are grown. The Rhine is another river with another history. Karl becomes a housekeeper in a retirement home run by a church foundation. He looks after hallways. He takes dishes from rooms and returns them gleaming. He learns the names of old men and women who do not taste their food but need it. He takes quiet pride in hot water and soap. They are tools as decent as a file and a wrench. 1982. An old man moves into room 212 on the second floor. He uses a cane with a silver knob. He always wears a tie, even in slippers. The intake form is routine. Name: Dr. Otto Wilms. Born 1906. Profession: retired, Regierungsrat, Ministry of Interior, Bonn. Next of kin: a son in Hamburg. Medical history: heart disease, frail balance, hearing loss in the left ear. Allergies: none declared. The staff call him Doctor. He corrects their grammar. He spells names out loud. He prefers his water at a specific temperature. He does not like the smell of boiled cabbage in the hall. He tells stories about the good old days of proper paperwork. He does not talk about 1933 to 1945. Karl does not ask for those stories. He does not need them. In the office downstairs is a green file with admission papers. In the file is a photocopy from 1951, a civil service record for rehiring under the 31 law. It lists prior service, Regierungsrat, Bezirksgrund Lublin, 1941-1941, 1941-1943. It says transferred for health reasons in 1943. It notes commendations for administrative excellence. Karl knows enough to know what those words can mean. He asks for public records under the Bundesarchiv Gesetz. He is told politely that such files are not readily accessible. He writes a request letter. He waits. It is 1983. He receives a reply 6 months later. It includes 3 pages from a Spruchkammer file in 1947. The categories appear like familiar ghosts. Dr. Wilms was labeled Minderbelasseter, lesser offender, with mitigating affidavits. He was apolitical. He only served in an administrative capacity. He provided assistance to a colleague in trouble. The fine was paid. He was barred from high office for 2 years. He was reinstated in 1951. There is a name like a pebble in the file. Vorladungszwecks, organisatorische Abwicklung von Evakuierungen. Summons for organizational handling of evacuations. The evacuations were of Jews from the Lublin district. The letters are clean and black and silent. Karl tells no one. He writes in his notebook. He signed deportation orders. He tells me I have left water in the sink overnight. He tries to wash this with soap. He watches the news. Trials take place in the 1980s still. Prosecutors in Frankfurt, in Cologne, in Munich seek men in their 80s and tell them that time is a thread that does not tear just because we abandon it. The judgments are meager sometimes. Suspended sentences. The courtrooms are tired. The newspapers say, too late. Survivors sit in back rows. They nod when someone says the name of a place that stands for the end of words. There is arithmetic in this too, of witnesses and years, of vanished and extant, of legal thresholds and moral accounts that do not balance. At work, Dr. Wilms complains about the water. Too cold, too hot, too much suds. He is polite without kindness. He says, standards are slipping. He says, in my day, a proper memorandum would fix this. He says, nothing functions anymore. He does not say, I am sorry. He does not say, I knew. He does not say, I knew. He does not say, I forgot. Carl learns to listen in a new way. He listens to old men talk about the bombings. He listens to a woman from Königsberg talk about the ice on the Frisch's Haff in 1945, about babies bundled in sheets, about the Soviet planes. He hears the arithmetic of suffering elevated to a proof that crowds out other sums. He hears pain that is real and large. He hears its use as a shield. He hears his own heart trying to be fair. In 1985, he finds an oral history project at the university. He is too old to study, but not too old to tell. A student in a sweater with holes in the elbows wants to record workers' memories of the factory and the rubble. Carl is put in a room with a microphone. He says things in sentences he did not know he had. He says, we boiled neckles. He says, there were Jews in the camp outside town. He says, I thought we were rebuilding a country that would learn to speak straight. The student asks him if he thinks Germans have faced their past. He says, after a pause that is a whole afternoon, we have faced enough of it to continue, not enough to rest. The arithmetic of shame is not a neat equation. It is the long division where the remainder will not resolve to zero. He tries to make numbers out of the impressions. How many of his colleagues made parts for machines they did not name? How many neighbors joined organizations they did not learn to doubt? How many men like Dr. Wilms signed orders they called routine? If there are 10 such men in a room of 100, what does the room owe? What if there are 20? What if there are 50? What if the room is a country? The numbers do not soothe. There are records for everything now. Bundesarchiv guides, microfilm reels, Allied interrogation reports available in reading rooms with signs that say, in German, please wear gloves. The cold of white cotton on the fingertips is a new kind of cold. The past is indeed a file. The file is a knife you must hold by the blade. Carl reads a 1942 report from an SS officer in Lublin to Berlin. It mentions the necessity of coordination with civil administration. It mentions transport quotas. It mentions timely expedition. It does not mention the river of people that moved under those subjects. You would not know, from reading it, that a woman once clutched her child's sleeve so hard that the wool unraveled. A retired British officer speaks at a library in Bonn in 1986. He reads from his occupation reports. He talks about denazification fatigue. He talks about pressure from London and Washington to build a reliable partner, not a purified one. He says, it was the right choice for the times. He says, we did not know how to weigh the scales. He sits afterward at a table and signs books. His handwriting is neat. Carl thinks about scales and about buckets and about sinks. He thinks about the way water does not stay hot but must be heated again and again to do its work. He thinks about hands. He thinks about hands on files and hands on cups and hands on bodies. He writes in his notebook on 12 September 1986, I once heard Brandt say, we must dare more democracy. We also must dare more memory, not as punishment, as infrastructure. The retirement home is a parade of endings. People leave more quietly than they came. The staff mark a name off a list and remove a photograph from a corkboard. The son who never visited comes to collect a watch. The granddaughter who always called sits in the corner and cries. The ward smells of disinfectant and soup. On January 3, 1987, a new resident arrives. His name is Shram, a former judge. He has read books since retirement. He speaks kindly. He says to Carl one afternoon, "Have you read anything by Primo Levi?" Carl shakes his head. He writes the name down and goes to the library. He comes home with a paperback. He reads sentences that seem to have been written for him or against him, or in a place where both positions dissolve. He reads about the grey zone. He reads about those who are neither heroes nor demons. He recognizes himself and strangers all at once. He writes on February 24, 1987, the sentence that began this account. He writes the scene as it is. No metaphors. The water is the wrong temperature. The man is alive. The papers exist. The past vibrates like a plucked string that does not die. The danger of the sentence is not that anyone will punish him. The danger is that in writing it, he will be unable to go back to a silence more comfortable than truth. He still empties the sink. He still sets the plates on the rolling trolley. He still visits room 2112 with a fresh towel. He is polite. He is firm. He is unarmed and unarmored. He is tired. He writes about the immediate after. He writes about rubble and cigarettes and the curfew that forced people to stop asking questions at 9 at night. He writes, too, about the ordinary beauty of rebuilt streets, about the first time he bought a washing machine, about the look on Ilse's face when hot water came from the tap without boiling. He writes about denazification files. He writes carefully about its categories. He writes about the mathematics of guilt, the way a mechanic writes about torque, measured, meaningful, not always visible to the eye. He writes that the system sought justice and found, often, compromise. He writes that it is easy to judge with the full stomach of 1987 what was decided with the hollow one of 1948, and difficult to judge if you also know the hollow. He does not excuse. He refuses to. He also refuses to demonize everyone he cannot absolve. The file on Dr. Wilms says the man gave a neighbor's child milk in 1944, that he spoke against a violent SS man once in a corridor. These are not redemptions. They are part of the arithmetic which does not absolve but requires inclusion. He writes about expellees sharing the coal scuttle and the curses that went with it. He writes about DP fences and the way the Allied guards looked at Germans like human beings who might do better or not. He writes about a Ukrainian who worked at a farm outside town who, one day in 1945, did not return. The farmer said he ran. The report said he ran. The report said he ran. The word ran sits on the page like a stone. The man has no grave. The town has no memory of him. The arithmetic of memory has a category called dropped terms. He writes about the school book that called 1933 to 1945 a period of misdirection, and about the teacher who said, privately, we were misdirected by ourselves. He writes about the children born in 1960 who can recite the names of concentration camps from television and who cannot tell you where their grandparents were on certain afternoons in 1942. He writes about the ease of learning what is beyond us and the difficulty of learning what is ours. He writes about the Cold War and the way its demand for loyalty bent accounting. He writes about the men who signed for paperclips in ministries with the same steadiness they had exhibited when signing for trains. He writes about the necessity of their steadiness and the corruption of their steadiness. He writes that a republic built with compromised hands still deserves the name if those hands learn, somehow, to hold something other than denial. He writes about marching bands. He writes about all that brass and all that bright. He writes about the days of remembrance in the 1950s that were for the dead in uniform, and the days of remembrance in the 1980s that are also for the dead without uniforms. He writes that both kinds of dead deserve words, and that the mathematics of grief is not a zero-sum game. On March 4th, 1987, Dr. Wilms falls in his room. He is found by a nurse. He is taken to the hospital. He is returned 2 days later with bruises and a new frailty. He beckons Carl when Carl brings the tray. He says, "The water. Today it is right." Carl nods. He takes the tray when the plates are empty. He empties the sink. He thinks about writing that sentence down, too. He does not. It does not feel dangerous or necessary. It feels like a day. In March, Jürgen visits with his own daughter, Sabine. She is 9. She sits at the kitchen table and asks questions. Why did that man have a cane? Why do we have a photograph of Opa in a uniform? The questions come as if they are dropping from a slope. You can choose to catch them. You can choose to let them fall. Carl chooses to answer. He chooses words like stepladders. Because he is old. Because everyone wore some kind of uniform then. He adds a sentence he has never said to a child. Some uniforms are dirtier than others, even when they look clean. He writes at the end of March. The war after the war is small duties performed by large ghosts. He writes again in May. To live with silence that keeps recurring, you must say a sentence every day that makes you slightly afraid. He writes about the arithmetic of food because it kept them alive. He writes about the mathematics of guilt because it threatens to kill the mind if miscounted. He writes about the algebra of law, the statutes that tried to build a democracy from pieces that fit poorly. He writes that the Cold War was a long addition problem that hid a subtraction in its middle, the subtraction of accountability for the sake of alliance. He writes that perhaps no other solution existed then. He writes that you should not build a nation twice on the back of forgetting. On June 17, 1987, a man in the cafeteria says, "The past is past." He says it with a fork in his hand and potatoes on his plate. Carl writes the sentence down and draws a line through it. He writes underneath, "The past is present. The present is a room furnished by the past." July 14, 1987, a delegation from the Ministry of Labour comes to present the retirement home with a small award for its training program. A young man in a suit shakes hands with staff, including. He says, "You do good work." Carl thanks him. He thinks about how in 1951 a man very much like this wrote a letter that returned Dr. Wilms to his desk. He thinks about how time is not a circle or a line, but a street with many doors, some of which lead nowhere, and some of which lead to rooms you have been in before without noticing. In August, the Rhine is low. The boats scrape. Carl takes a Sunday to walk along the bank. He watches a child throw stones and count ripples. He thinks about the mathematics of ripples as if it is related to everything else. He thinks about the way an action expands beyond the thrower's intention. He watches the rings expand and thin and disappear into the general motion of the river. He writes, "Just because a circle disappears does not mean it never disturbed the water." In October, a letter arrives. It is from a distant cousin with a photograph of Carl's father in uniform, summer 1942, smiling in a field of sunflowers somewhere east. He was 28. He had a boyish face. He died, likely, in a place called by foreign names, no grave. The photograph is a remnant without an address. Carl places it in his notebook. He stares at his father's eyes and says out loud the first line of this account. He says it in a voice that he knows now would have cost him work in 1951, friends in 1961, comfort in 1971, and that costs him something even now, when the price is less. On December 9, 1987, Dr. Wilms dies. It is, in the files, routine. Cause, myocardial infarction. Time of death, 03/2012. Next of kin notified, son in Hamburg, message left. Writes, Catholic. The file contains a copy of his will, dated 1979. He leaves money to a foundation and to his son, a painting to a distant niece. There is no apology in any of it. There is, in a folder marked Personal Effects, a small leather-bound notebook with lists of books, lists of wine, lists of doctors. There is no list marked Things for which I ask forgiveness. Carl attends the funeral because he attends them all. It is not personal, it is a function. The priest says words he has said before. The son looks at his watch. The coffin is lowered into a grave that bears a name, unlike so many Carl has learned about in rooms with files and films. That difference is a fact that stretches wider than the trench. It is a fact you can break your heart on if you are not careful. After the funeral, Carl returns to work. He empties a sink. He slows, suddenly. He writes in his notebook, "The man who never apologized has gone where apologies have no currency." He sets the notebook aside. He fills a basin with hot water. He puts both hands in. He holds them there until the heat bites. He removes them and watches the steam. He dries his hands. He goes on. The rooms in his head are no longer arranged the way they were in 1945 or 1951 or 1968. The furniture has moved.